Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and it's my privilege to have my friend, Reverend Mark Danzey. When I first became interested in coaching, Mark is one of the people that I reached out to for some training. So he coached me for a while, and Mark has been coaching professionals and pastors in a variety of different industries for the last 25 years. I've come to know Mark well, and he's passionate about his work. And he's great at helping executives, directors, managers, and individuals lead, equip, and inspire. He has certifications with the International Coaching Federation, as well as he's a certified Strengthsfinder coach from Gallup, and he is an Enneagram trainer. And I know Mark is just a guy that loves Jesus and loves extending essentially the mission of the gospel through coaching. And so, Mark, thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's an honor, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's just jump right into it. Can you just in a few minutes introduce yourself to those who may not know you by talking about your spiritual journey and what were the key moments that led you initially to ministry? You're an ordained deacon with the United Methodist Church, and then also adding coaching and mediation and some of the other exciting things that you do. What were some key moments on your spiritual journey?
Well, I came to Christ October 22nd, 1989 at 11 p.m. on the third floor of Athens Regional Medical Center in Athens, Georgia. It was kind of a long traumatic event. My wife at the time we'd been married for 6 days, and she was involved in a near fatal car accident. And not to be over dramatic, but it's just the truth. So she was in a coma for the first 2 months of our marriage, and I was not a believer. So a lot of details around that story, but basically came to Christ while she was in a coma. And when she woke up, I was a Christian. She had not married a Christian, and started going to church with a drinking buddy from high school who heard about my plight, met me in the hospital, had been a Christian about 6 months, and invited me to his church. And I thought, I'd given my heart to God in the hospital. I went to a Gideon's Bible. Some guy named Gideon had left his Bible in a dresser drawer there, and I started reading it and couldn't understand it, but I felt like it was the right thing I should do. And I basically gave God 1 year of my life, Brian, and I said, Lord, if this isn't worth it, I'm going to go back to the way I was. And of course, I didn't know 2 Corinthians 5:17 that said they that are in Christ are a new creation. There wasn't anything to go back to. And so God was good, and started my faith journey then. Just a couple of years later, just felt this incredible tugging to go into ministry. So I was 23 and started pursuing ministry as a vocation, and a lot of, I wish we had 5 hours because there's just so many great God stories in how that happened. But basically stumbled into the United Methodist Church through meeting a Methodist pastor, and he asked me to come on staff with him, and I did. And so for the last 28 years, I've been serving in some capacity, from youth ministry to discipleship ministry to executive pastor. I've played about every role you can play in the local church. But about 10 years ago is when I really started focusing on disciple making and how to take a person from newfound faith in Christ to becoming a disciple making reproducer. And I had done ministry for 15 years. I don't think I discipled one person. If I did, it was purely by accident. But just started developing a strategy to do that. And in doing that, in my context as an associate pastor, began discipling men in small group context, and really started unearthing serious life challenges that they were facing. And felt ill-equipped. Seminary did not equip me. It equipped me to preach and do some basic things, but it didn't equip me how to walk a man through addiction or divorce or career changes or just spiritual growth. So I had to find that in the secular world, honestly. And so that's kind of some of the way I came into coaching and addiction counseling, and then divorce mediation and domestic mediation while serving as a pastor. That's kind of my rough version of how I got there.
Yeah, and so you talk about disciple making and coaching. So we have a lot of pastors that are listening, and there's lay folks who listen as well. But how do you see coaching serving in the life of a church or in the life of an individual Christian?
Well, so I think coaching does a couple of major things. Number one, it meets a person where they are in life or career, or whether you're the CEO of a company. Every successful CEO has a coach. Every successful athlete has a coach.
Or
We just
multiple
can't figure this
coaches, right?
stuff out.
Yeah.
Multiple, right? We just can't figure this stuff out on our own. So pastors are the worst, in my opinion, of feeling like, well, I've been to seminary, so I should know how to do all these things, and I can't ask for help. So what I've seen in coaching is it really meets a person where they are in life, love, career, and then helps them figure out where they want to be, vision where they want to go, and then build a plan and provide benchmarks and steps and accountability to reach that goal. So in ministry, what I've experienced as far as pastors are concerned, they only have a couple of goals. And that is, butts in the seat and bucks in the coffer. And, the things the conference asks us for, right, to put on the form. But some of the things that are not on the form that we feel like we're being accountable for are things like spiritual growth. I mean, how do you measure that? People who are now trained to be disciple makers. I've never seen that on a form for the conference because it doesn't seem to be, what's measured. And so, of course, what's not measured is not managed. But I think coaching really provides that place for someone to learn a new skill set or to learn a new craft, and to take the talents and strengths that they have and really put them into meaningful transformation versus just kind of kicking the ministry can down the road. Mm-hmm. That's been my that's what I think ministry or coaching actually offers to ministry. Now, disciple making, we know that Dr. Robert Coleman, by the way, wrote a book in 1960 called The Master Plan of Evangelism. You know it well. You know Dr. Coleman well. He's been in my house and had dinner, and I felt like I was sitting at the feet of the Apostle Paul. I have great respect for Dr. Coleman. But he basically looked at the 8 things that Jesus did in training of those 12. And in training those 12, basically we can apply those 8 principles too. And it makes disciple makers is what it does, right? And so, but it's really coaching if you think about it. It's building a strategy and a plan with some accountability, a desired outcome at the end, and then working toward that goal or that desired outcome. So I see discipleship and coaching very similar.
That's good. And like, can you just give a word of testimony? Like I could sit here and say how even working with you when you were my coach helped me to become a better coach and helped me to see some blind spots in my life. But yourself as a person who coaches, how has coaching impacted you personally that keeps you excited about it?
Well, thank you, by the way. Working with you was a privilege, still is a privilege. Now I'm working with you in some other venues too, which is exciting. I would say this, that of the Bible college that I attended, the seminary that I went to, the trauma and addiction counseling training that I got, all of that, nothing transformed my life like coaching. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that when I got into it. I was going to learn how to be a coach. But in order to learn how to be a coach, you have to be coached. And since that time, I've always had a coach now myself, because it literally transformed my life. Of all the things that I would point back to and say has been the most transforming. It actually transformed my ministry too, because now what I do is a tremendous amount of coaching. And I would say 12 years ago, I didn't even know what coaching was. If you said you were a coach, I thought you meant like you're a high school volleyball coach or a football coach. I had no idea this world even existed. But what it did for me, a couple of things, was it taught me how to listen and how to, instead of showing up with information, how to really listen to a person, where they are and what's tripping them up, and help them get past those hurdles or those pitfalls that continually keep them kind of tethered to the ground when they're really meant to soar. I found in coaching that it made me a better listener. Number two was how to ask good questions. I would say in my marriage counseling work that I've done, I work with a lot of couples, especially couples in crisis. I would teach them that 2/3 of good communication is listening. But I think another form of good communication is learning how to ask good questions. And I would say nothing in my life really ever prepared me for that, like coaching did. Now I can't turn the spigot off. Everybody I meet, I'm asking them, short, profound questions I hear that a lot because I've been trained to do it now. People will say to me all the time, wow, that's a good question. That to me as a coach is a compliment. That's the greatest compliment because it's in those questions is where I think we find the real answers for ourselves. So that's been interesting fact about that. Jesus, who, of course, the ultimate coach, greatest coach that's ever lived, right? I saw some stats last week. A friend of mine named Adam Borneman shared with me that Jesus asked in the Gospels 307 questions. He was asked 183 questions, and he directly answered 3 to 8, depending on which theologian you follow, which tells us that the man knew how to ask good questions, and he did a lot. So coaching is Christ-like, in my opinion.
What are just I always try to give everybody my questions in advance so you have time to think about. So this one's coming out of the blue off of what you just said. What are some of your favorite questions that you ask, say a client or say somebody that you're trying to disciple that you found to be really powerful over the years? Do you have like 2 or 3 like go-to questions that you know are going to elicit a good place to begin?
Yeah, I definitely. Of course, the number one question I like to ask, and this is a coaching question I've heard many coaches ask prior. So, by the way, any question I give you now, I didn't invent it. I just heard it. I don't have an original thought. So if I don't give proper credit to where it came from, Lord, forgive me. But one powerful question I like to ask is, what's the greatest problem you're facing in life, and how can I help you solve it? I think that's a great question to ask. Another one that you and I use a lot too is, 3 years from now, looking back, what will have had to change to make the biggest impact in your life? Another great one. Another great one is, what would your 80-year-old self tell you to do in this situation? Because usually our 80-year-old self would be a lot wiser than our current self, right? And so we can kind of tap into that. Another sifting or defining question is, what do you really want?
That's hard to answer, isn't it? That's for a lot of people.
It is, especially when you say really, right?
Really.
What do you really want? So the best questions are short and powerful. They're less than 8 words. If you have to qualify your question, you've lost it. Short, powerful questions. Jesus asked that when the rich young ruler came up, right? Why do you call me good? Amazing question. So I think short, powerful ones. Another one is to ask the question why 6 times in a row. So when somebody says, I don't really like my job, why? And now you do sound like a toddler, and it can be annoying. Because the people I work with, well, why? Well, because this one guy just is rude all the time. Why? Well, because his wife's been, you can just go down that trail, and then people begin to realize that there's a lot of reasons that are stacking up that can be solved, or the proper perspective could be changed. Another question is, what's another way to look at this issue? We know that in every crisis or challenge that there is filled with opportunities. So a question would be, so maybe this is a bad scenario that's happened. Well, what's one opportunity in this for you? Even if it's to learn patience, well, that's an opportunity, right? So those are just a few.
That was good. That was good, Mark. And I was just thinking that when you say that, in the sense, what we're trying to do with the questions is we're just trying to let a person that we're speaking with, it's like in a sense, as a coach, we do care what the answer is, but we're helping the person to actually draw something out of themselves to get that really moment of insight. It'd be fun to play around with the question, what do you really want? I found, you ask, it seems like sometimes us, we who are in the church and maybe even pastors, we struggle to answer the question, what do you really want? Because it always seems like it comes into conflict, perhaps, with what we think Jesus might want. And so do you find that to be a common issue with the pastors that you work with, that it's usually we'd rather have somebody else, like we might complain about the job description that we have, but when you ask, well, what do you really want? Then I don't know what I really want. What's my job description? So you find people bounce around with that. Have you found that to be true with sometimes persons with deep faith, that they sometimes are afraid to express who they really are, what they really want?
Oh, absolutely. My personal experience with that is as a pastor for 28 years, I projected what I thought a pastor should look like, talk like, sound like, and what I thought the church wanted me to be, versus who I was really created to be. And so you talked about the Enneagram earlier. That was one life-changing experience for me. And our young worship leader at the church told me about it. I'd never heard the word. I always heard if you read 5 books on any subject, you become an expert. So I read 5 books on the Enneagram. I didn't know jack about it even after that. So I went through a training and understood it. But what I understood from that was that the church tries to turn everybody into a 2. It doesn't know what to do with a 7. A 2 is a loving helper, serving. And so everybody should be that. But if your personality is more joy and adventure, well, what do you do with that? And that's me. I'm a 7, which is all about joy, adventure, spontaneity, new things, encouragement. And what I saw in the church were people that got promoted in ministry were people who were 2s and 3s, like you. People who were effective and efficient and got all the details done right and on time. And I just watched, and of course I didn't know anything about the Enneagram, but I watched these people getting promoted and applauded. And then people who were creative and adventurous, they kind of got made fun of unknowingly. So I became a carbon copy of what I thought a successful pastor was supposed to look like and be like, and was not true to who God created me to be, my unique abilities. So through the coaching and these different assessments that I started applying, Strengthsfinders for one, I started realizing, wow, God has uniquely and wonderfully made me. And the best thing I could do for the rest of my life is live into that, not some cookie cutter prescription of what I think a pastor should look like. And it's kind of funny when you get into Christian circles too, and I don't want anybody to be offended by this, but you got to admit it's true. You get a bunch of large church pastors together, they have a kind of a look and a talk about them, you can almost spot them. You get some millennial worship leaders together, and you can spot them, right? The way they dress, the way they talk, the way they sit, what they're drinking. Get seminary professors together. I mean, you can spot them. We just kind of
be careful here, Mark.
So just think about that for a second. And what we do is we kind of self-categorize what we should look, think, feel, and act versus being true to the unique ability that God has created us.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's what I love about coaching, is strip that junk away and figure out who God has created you to be and live into that fully. I speak of that with excitement. I know I sound a little zealous on that, but it's because I finally got to do ministry in my own skin after a couple of decades. If you'd have said to me 10 years ago, what do you really want? You would have heard crickets. I didn't know, because I didn't know who I was.
That's so good. And I really liked how you went with that answer. In a sense, at some level, coaching's about freedom. And when we talk about the gospel, you even think about the Exodus story. And again, I'm not going to make this about me, but one of the things I always say in Exodus, a lot of times we just focus on what's Exodus. Oh, that's when God got the people out of Israel. Well, that's the first 15 chapters. Exodus 16 to 40 is, okay, what now? So it's not just freedom from something, it's freedom for something. And I think a lot of times when the very thing that you're talking about, not knowing what we want, is we've lost a sense of freedom for. I mean, even the questions you listed, you're trying to elicit, like, what would an 80-year-old version tell me to do? And it's always trying to grasp around, how do you live, or 3 years from now, all those questions. It's trying to be more expansive, essentially, to help, ironically, especially since the gospel is supposed to be liberating. Oftentimes it becomes constricting, and it becomes a burden instead of a joy and a sense of fulfillment. But, coaching, in a sense, is to try to help persons to allow themselves to be liberated by God, to truly live and become and breathe and walk as the person that God created us to be. So, you hit on identity. What are some other, just talking to pastors now, and when we talk pastors, if you're a lay person, I don't want you to go to church and think that, look at your pastor and just think, oh, geez, I heard Brian and Mark say all this stuff, and start being skeptical. But, but if we're talking to pastors, what are some common things that you find that spiritual leaders, pastors struggle with, that coaching can help them overcome?
Well, the first one that comes to the top of my head is a quote from Paul Tripp, who said that the best definition he knows of a pastor is a quivering mass of availability. And God, that hits me right between the eyes when I think about my life and trying to raise a family and trying to say yes to everybody that ever asked me to do anything for them, because I thought that's what it meant to be a successful pastor. So coaching helps you really define not only who you are, but also what are the most effective roles I can play? How do I say no to things in my life? Because I forget the philosopher that said that knowledge is adding something every day, and wisdom is subtracting something every day. Well, pastors, after a period of time, become quivering masses of availability who have added so many things to their life. They're the most overworked, overrun, overused leaders in our culture. And so they don't know how to unwind. They don't know how to discover who they really are, what they really want. And it's because we've overcommitted. And so I think one of the things that coaching can do for pastors is help them to know what to say yes to and what to say no to. It's kind of crafting that rule of life that I know you're so well versed in, is how do you set those boundaries in your own personal life? Because pastors don't know how to Sabbath. Pastors, they don't know how. They want to, but they just don't feel like they have the ability to. Sorry, I got a text coming in there. My apologies. See, I'm overcommitted, even texting while I'm trying to do an interview on overcommitment. So I think that's one thing, is coaching sets boundaries. Number two, coaching helps reveal who you really, really have been created to be. There's just not a course you can take or a Bible study that you can take that really defines that. I think you have to do it through individual coaching. And then what are your unique abilities and your talents, and how can you turn those talents into strengths? So one of the things I do in Strengthsfinders is we think that if you get your top 5 listed, well, these are my top 5 strengths. No, they're your top 5 talents. Mm-hmm. So a talent developed becomes a strength. So what coaching does is develops or exposes what are the unique talents you have as an individual, a leader, a pastor, whatever. And then how do you now work on developing that talent so that it truly becomes a strength? There's a lot of pastors out there that think they have the talent of preaching, and so they think that's enough.
Yeah.
Well, if you develop that talent, it will be a strength. But if you just ride on it as a talent, you'll never be at the top of your game. So that's kind of a few things that I think coaching does specifically for pastors.
Yeah, it's good. And I know that a part of your coaching ministry, and you gave me just a little bit of training in this, but you've got some certification and some training in working with addictions, and you found that addiction isn't just something that takes place outside the church. You actually have addiction sometimes takes place in the church. What role can coaching play for a pastor? And, when we're talking about addictions, oftentimes, and again, we're not trying to paint this across the board with people, but there's a lot of Christians that struggle with the opioid crisis, obvious piece, but then probably more commonly just alcohol and a lot of times pornography. And so, and people that are deeply spiritual can struggle with these types of things too. What have you found as an approach as a coach? And again, I know this is a big topic, but what role does coaching have in helping a person who is struggling with various levels of addiction?
Good question. I would say that counseling, there's a distinct difference in coaching, consulting, and counseling.
Yeah, it's important, isn't it?
I didn't know those differences. I thought it was all kind of the same thing. So counseling really spends an amount of time looking back at the reasons for this addictive behavior. So Paul called them flesh patterns. Anything, a coping mechanism. In other words, if we're dealing with anxiety in our life, thank goodness pastors don't have to deal with anxiety. And we develop coping mechanisms for dealing with that addiction. Well, then the coping mechanism can turn into what we call a flesh pattern or addiction. Okay. And so what happens is that someone becomes addicted, having never setting out to ever dreaming that would happen. Right. So counseling really looks back a lot at how this developed and then some steps forward. Coaching actually focuses more on the future than on the past. You want to do a little bit of that rear view mirror time, but it's mostly windshield time. And so with coaching, asking good questions, setting benchmarks for people, just having real honest conversations. There's no judgment in coaching. You leave judgment at the door. It really helps a person envision what would a life of sobriety look like, feel like, what would the benefits be? What is this currently costing you? What are the risks and the dangers that will accompany you if you continue in this behavior? And so I use kind of a mixture of coaching and counseling work when I work with people who struggle with addiction. One thing exclusive, though, to addiction is almost every case of addiction I work with, whether it's sexual addiction or alcoholism or gambling addiction, or now we're seeing gaming addiction. Wow. Some people scoff at that, but tell the young couple I'm working with who've been married for 3 years and he can't hold a job because he's playing video games 8 hours a day. It's a real issue for them, and he can't stop without some help. But one of the things that we do is look at the addiction cycle and how it is the brain works and what trauma is tied to this addiction. So one of the exclusive things about addiction is most people who are struggling have had some past trauma that has either created or perpetuated this addiction. And so really kind of unearthing that and dealing with that to move forward, coaching them, is really important. So it's almost now, some people, I used to look at people who struggle with addiction and say, well, just quit, get over it. What are you doing? What are you thinking? Not realizing the trauma in most people's lives that led to that flesh pattern. So it actually creates empathy when we start recognizing that the current destructive behavior a person is dealing with developed as them trying to get some relief from some other pain in their life. So I would say that through the addiction work, the trauma work, and I work with a lot of pastors who struggle with sexual addiction. Of course, it's confidential, so I'll never share a word of that. But I see some trends with people. And I've got one of the common stories I've heard, which is unbelievable, is a pastor never had looked at pornography before until they went to a conference who talked about the dangers of pornography and got triggered by it and began looking at pornography, the very thing. So it's subtle.
Yeah.
But that's, I guess one of the things that makes my coaching so enjoyable and life-giving for me and for those that I coach is the empathy that is brought because of past trauma. So trauma and addiction therapy really go hand in hand.
Yeah, and that's an important insight. Obviously, we can go a lot deeper in that. I literally just finished a book over the weekend called "The Body Keeps the Score." That was essentially a book about trauma, and then how oftentimes it manifests not just in addictions, but in all kinds of pieces that sometimes get misdiagnosed, and we end up treating kind of the surfacing issues and not trying to heal the deep inner core. And and that's one of the things that love about the gospel is we have tools and we can do counseling, we can do coaching, but the wonderful thing is these are tools that maybe make it a little easier for the spirit to do the real work of transformation and healing. And that's one of the beautiful pieces. And you've touched on this a little bit. Talk a little bit about maybe a little bit more about the relationship between deep spiritual formation and how coaching can facilitate that in somebody's life. Like if a person's like, I've been a Christian for a long time, or they're just stuck. How can coaching really help open a person up to deeper levels of spiritual formation? Or even the phrase that I like to use in this podcast is, as Methodists, entire sanctification. We're talking about holiness, becoming the person that God created us to be. What role does coaching play in that, Mark?
Well, my mentor, one of my mentors, John Musselman, shares this analogy of the higher the skyscraper is going to be built, the deeper the foundation has to be.
That's good.
If you're going to build a 1-story building, you don't need that deep of a foundation. If you're going to build a 100-story building, you need a very deep foundation. And so for the person, I think, that wants to be really successful in life and successful in ministry and accomplished and just productive, really productive, you got to have a firm foundation to be able to grow that high. And so spiritual formation happens when the individual decides that, spiritual growth is a lifetime exercise. And this is not something most pastors, Brian, as you know, stats say, and of course, Barna depresses us with all this stuff, but he, love you, Barna. But he says that the average pastor spends about 5 minutes a day in spiritual formation.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the time as that quivering mass of availability, trying to get the punch list done, right? So coaching and holding people accountable for developing their own personal worship. So one of the things we teach in disciple making is what this personal worship really looks like. And the pastor that's doing personal worship, and we know what corporate worship is, but what is that worship of God that happens when you're by yourself for 30 minutes a day, just you and the Lord? And what is it you do? And how can you share what you do with other people that don't know how to do that so that they can then have rich lives of spiritual formation? So in coaching, one of the things that we do is help develop a plan of spiritual formation. There's not one way to do it, right? And so what works for you? If you've got a very short attention span versus someone who's a lot more studious and focused, you can't do the same exact thing. So what would really work for you? And so coaching, we help people discover, okay, this didn't work. Let's try something new. A rule of life, crafting that, setting 3 spiritual goals for the next 90 days, setting that time apart. All these things coaching provides for that person so that they come out of that time of personal worship and say, wow, that was really meaningful. I want to do that again tomorrow. That's good. Yeah, a lot of Christians do personal worship or quiet time or devotional because they feel like they're supposed to, not because they want to. Coaching helps you realize the great benefit of this so that you look forward to that time with the Lord. One of the things we know is the Lord looks forward to time with us. The question is, do we look forward to time with the Lord? Well, if we're not getting a lot of meaning out of it, then we probably don't. And so some of that is people haven't been trained, like your book on centering prayer. How do you do centering prayer? Well, you got to be coached. You got to be trained how to do it, demonstrated how to do that, or else you'll never know. So I call that coaching spiritual formation. Another real key element, though, to this, I think gets overlooked a lot, is vulnerability.
Yes.
One reason a pastor will never get coached or never attain to potential is because they're not vulnerable enough. They don't feel like they can be vulnerable enough. And so coaching provides the ability to just really share what your struggles are, what's keeping you stuck, so that we can develop a plan forward. And so I think coaching and spiritual formation thrives when there's a level of trust and vulnerability. So pastors don't really want to go to counselors. I mean, if you get 10 pastors together in a room and you say, how many of you are in regular counseling or therapy? You know, if they are, they might not admit it. But coaching tends to, I say it this way, it's not therapy, but it's therapeutic. And one of the ways it's therapeutic is through offering a place for a pastor to be vulnerable.
Yes.
So that they can grow forward. If you're not vulnerable, you're not going to grow. And, you know, Brene Brown says that vulnerability is the ultimate sign of courage. Let me explain that. Anytime we hear somebody on a platform being vulnerable, we always look at them and say, wow, that took a lot of courage to say that. But when we're being vulnerable behind the pulpit, we always feel like it's a symbol of weakness. Now, isn't it funny that when we see that in others, we admire it as a courageous quality, but when we're doing it, we feel like, you know, we're being weak. So it's not. So one of the things coaching does is helps you realize that, you know, vulnerability is the ultimate sign of courage. You can't get more vulnerable than hanging on a cross naked before your mother. And nobody looks at Jesus nailed to a cross as weak. Brother, that's courage.
Powerful.
That's strength.
Yeah.
That's strength. So I would say to you pastors out there that don't feel like you can be vulnerable, man, you got to get over that. You've created your own glass ceiling with that junk, because your congregation needs you to be more vulnerable. Now, don't send me emails about that. Just take it for what it's worth. But find you a coach. Call Brian. Call me, and let us help you with that.
Yeah, and at the end of if you listen all the way to the end, I'm going to put a little piece in. Mark and I do have a group coaching program that's designed for pastors that we've been working on for a good chunk of 2020. That would be grateful to if any persons are actually interested in a group program. But Mark, this is an interview with you, so I have a couple of final questions. Like, so if somebody would want to work with you, or knows even somebody in the church that maybe a business owner that could really use a good Christian coach, or it's a pastor, what are the best ways for folks to find out more about you all? And I'll put all these in the notes, but how can people connect with you and what you offer on a one-on-one basis?
Well, thank you, Brian. My website is wisepathcoach.com, and WISEPATH, wisepathcoach.com. This is where most of my secular coaching, leadership coaching that I do. I work with CEOs and folks who are making career changes, those types of things, just life, relationships, midlife crisis stuff, whatever. Just help you figure out how to take that next step. Because here's the deal. What got you to where you are won't get you to where you want to go. You got to develop some new skill sets and some new awarenesses. That's the one way, wisepathcoach.com. Another one, ministry that I do is specifically around disciple making and helping pastors turn their churches into disciple making, changing the culture of their organization to focus on disciple making. And that's, I'm the executive director of Narrowgate Equipping for Life. And so that website is narrowgateefl.com. And there's a crazy amount of free resources on there. Teachings, videos, white papers for pastors who may feel like, you know, we've done a great job of getting people into the building or online now with COVID, right? And connected to our church and maybe serving, but they're not turning into disciple makers. And so this organization, Narrowgate, really focuses on how to do that. So we call it Narrowgate Equipping for Life, and we do three things. We disciple, mentor, and coach. And so that's more on the ministry side of things. So those would be two great. And I would love to just have a conversation with anybody that wants to explore those as well. But I do say that the the most economical way is through the group that you and I offer. You can't get any more economical than that one. We basically, it's a service that we provide for pastors who've been struggling through COVID and how to reinvent what they've been doing and what they want to do, because we were thrown a massive curveball. The ministry, the church world was thrown a massive curveball in March. And so, what many pastors feared was going to be happening in decline over the next 5 years, we've seen in 5 months. Pastors not knowing how to shepherd their congregation when they can't get them in the building. So what you and I are doing, trying to help pastors figure that out, but also it's just life-giving because we're doing some soul tending there too. So these are 3 great ways, I think, to get some real help and move forward.
And just a quick final question for you. What are 2 or 3 resources or books outside of Scripture that you found profoundly helpful, that have shaped you deeply in your own life?
Great question. From a ministry perspective, it would probably be Master Plan of Evangelism by Dr. Robert Coleman, because it's literally an expose of what were the 8 things Jesus did in training those 12 that are applicable today. That's a huge one. Another book that I'm really, really, really fond of is a book by Richard Rohr called Breathing Underwater.
It's a good book.
It's an excellent book because it looks at spirituality and the 12 steps. He basically summarizes that the 12 steps for recovery came out of the Gospels. And you can see scripture all over it. That would be a book there. And then as far as just so I would say that's a ministry book. One of them is a coaching book. Another one is a book by Shirzad Shamin called Positive Intelligence. And it looks at the self-sabotaging dialogue that we share. I use this with all my clients, by the way. It looks at the self-sabotaging dialogue that we live in daily that keeps us grounded. And I mean grounded in a negative form. Like if you're meant to fly, you don't want to be grounded, right? And so it looks at how do we look at our life and perspective and situations in a way that moves us forward versus keeps us held back. And so of the 50,000 conversations the average human has in a day, most of them are with ourselves. And a lot of them are very negative. And that just doesn't propel somebody into courageous leadership. So that would be another, it's a very secular book, comes out of a lot of work at Stanford. If you go through the MBA program at Stanford, you're probably going to be introduced to that resource. And then, of course, anything around the Enneagram as well. I think the Enneagram is a very insightful tool. So there's 4 books. How about that for your overachieving answer?
Oh, that's perfect. And being a 3, I have to press one more just to be a little bit more deep on the Enneagram. So if you're just going to pick one book, I mean, there's so many books. So if somebody goes on Amazon, there's going to be an array. What's your favorite book if somebody's not just for the kind of a first-time introduction to the Enneagram?
Well, Claire and Scott Lockridge out of Marshall, Michigan is the training organization I went through for the Enneagram. And they look at the Harmony Triad version of that. Let me grab the title real quick. It's right here. The title is Spiritual Rhythms of the Enneagram.
Okay.
And it's a book, but it's / workbook.
Gotcha.
So it's of the 7 or 8 Enneagram books I have, that one's probably the one I go to the most with clients. Okay. I think there's a lot of Richard Rohr's Enneagram, A Christian Perspective is a deeper textbook on it. But I don't recommend that one a lot to people because I'm afraid they won't read it. You got it. Look at there.
It is on the YouTube. For those of you watching on the video, there it is. It is a little hard to read, but it's a very good book. There's so many good books. Well, this has been wonderful, Mark. And I just want to thank you again. It's funny. We connected through a former Asbury student. I was talking about becoming a coach, and the guy goes, "You got to talk to Mark Danzey." I'm like, "Who's Mark Danzey?" And we became friends. And then I immediately hired you to become my coach. And now we're working together. And again, if you just stay tuned, Mark and I will talk a little bit more about the program that we offer if you're interested in some group coaching. But Mark, it's just been an absolute privilege to get to know you. I'm grateful for your ministry. I'm grateful for the skin in the game that you put into all these things, even in your entrepreneurial spirit and your genuine desire to help people and bring a sense of humor to everything too, because I tend to be pretty serious. So it's kind of like where you're the good cop, I'm the bad cop, or however you want to think about that. But it's a lot of fun. It's been a real pleasure to know you, and thank you so much for being my guest today.
Well, I would say you're more John Wesley. I'm more Charles Wesley. How about that?
I think I'd rather be the bad cop than John Wesley. He was a little dour, I think. No, but I don't know if I can say that. That's a good joke, though. So that's good. Well, anyway, I want to thank everybody for listening today. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope to others. Amen. Hey, before you go, Mark and I have an exciting opportunity that we want to tell you about. We've partnered together to create a program just for pastors. And I know that most of you are either pastors or know a pastor. So have them check out Group Coaching for Pastors. And Mark, why would a group coaching program be helpful for a pastor?
Well, you know as well as I do from being coached and being having a coach yourself that the challenges that we face in leadership and in ministry can't be all figured out just between your ears. You've got to have somebody to bounce ideas off of. You've got to have somebody to process questions and some best practices around. And so, every successful CEO has a coach. They know the power of it. But oftentimes for pastors, they don't see the need in it. So what we know is that coaching can actually cause you to discover your highest values and then how you live in them in your own leadership or the organization that you're leading. And also not only elevates your game, but gives you the ability to invest in your team long-term and elevate their game too.
Yeah, and we've been working with a group of pastors. We started really during the COVID-19 quarantine, which in some ways we're still kind of in that phase, but it's gone so well that we want to allow even more pastors to have the benefits of this. And so check out groupcoachingforpastors.com, and here's some of the promises that we make that we can deliver for you, because this is all about helping you to grow even deeper spiritually and helping you to become even more effective as a leader in the local church for God's mission. And Mark, do you want to tell them about some of the things that we're promising? What are some of the results that folks are going to experience personally here?
Well, yeah, one is beginning to eliminate the false beliefs that sabotage us. Some of the experts say we have about 50,000 conversations a day, many of them in our own head. And oftentimes they are the very things that sabotage our ability to lead others. And so pastors are not exempt from that. That's definitely one thing that they'll get. Also, we work on crafting a rhythm of life that aligns with your unique personality. Personality, we believe, comes from God. And how is it that God has crafted us not to be like the pastor down the street or the pastor on the other side of the country, but in our unique ability, how can we live into that? One of the biggest things that we hear, Brian, is getting control of your time. It's the only commodity we have. We don't know how much we have. And so pastors typically are running to and fro, trying to get everything done. And working with a coach allows you to gain control of your time, which actually leads to gaining control of your sanity too. Leading others more effectively. Like we said earlier, when you elevate your game in leadership, it elevates everyone around you in leadership. And then just deeper levels of spiritual formation. Pastors get so engaged with preaching sermons and figuring out how to do church now in the new normal, and then hiring staff or firing staff. And we forget that most of what we are delivering to our congregation comes from the deep well of our own spirituality. And so we want to make sure that there's some soul tending that takes place in this coaching. And this is what we hear from the folks that we've been coaching. Oftentimes it means so much to them.
Yeah, so check out groupcoachingforpastors.com. And Mark and I, we bring a lot of experience to the table from I'm a seminary professor, and I've been coaching for a number of years. I've been pastoral ministry. Mark's been long-term pastoral ministry, as well as being a coach and a mediator. So we're going to bring all the best of our own stuff. We merge it together as a team to deliver for you an exceptional value. So we hope to hear from you. So sign up at groupcoachingforpastors.com, and we'll take your email, and we'll invite you to a powerful group coaching session where you can get a taste of what we can deliver for you. And then if you want to go forward, we'll give you that opportunity. So thank you so much. And do you have a final word, Mark?
Yeah, the initial group coaching session is free. So you literally have nothing to lose. We'd love to meet you.
Groupcoachingforpastors.com, and we look forward to working with you to help you to achieve the mission that God's calling you to, and do it while flourishing in your life also.